Now we're going to talk about shutter speed. Shutter speed is one of the more fun variables to play around with because you can get some really cool effects with long exposures. With DSLRs, it's really easy to tell when the shutter is open. There's an audible click that you can hear when the shutter opens or closes, but that's actually, most of the click is actually the mirror that you're hearing flipping up. With SLRs and DSLRs, the mirror is, of course, how you look through the viewfinder and look through the lens, so you see what the lens sees. But with a mirrorless camera or something like a smartphone sensor, your viewfinder is a screen, so the sensor is always open to preview the image to see what the camera is seeing. Then when you take a picture with the mirrorless, it's basically an electronic shutter. So you take a picture and it sends a signal to the sensor to halt all image viewing purposes and whatnot and downscaling, and just take an image of raw data off the sensor. Then convert it to a JPEG if you're shooting in JPEG, but you usually want to shoot in RAW. With shutter speed, your optimal settings depend entirely on what kind of photography you're doing. If you're doing something like sports, action, something where there's a lot of motion, especially with like water or children, and portraits in general, you really want fast shutter speeds. Or even if you're just hand holding a camera for any purpose, you usually want at least over like 1/10 of a second for most things. Because when the shutter is open on a camera, light is constantly hitting the sensor. So that makes it so that long exposures, you can get really cool things that the human eye can't see, because our eyes are tuned to see the world in kind of like movie mode, with 30 frames per second or around there. That's the kind of the fastest. 30 or 60 frames per second is usually the fastest that the human eye can discern. So we don't see motion blur like a camera can. So if I take this image at 1/200th of a second, it looks like that. And that is how shutter speed is measured. It's measured in fractions of a second or whole seconds if you're talking about long exposures, longer than 1 second. If I take this same photo at 5 seconds, so 5 whole seconds of light hitting the sensor, it looks like this. So that blur is caused by light constantly hitting the sensor for a span of 5 seconds. So that's a long exposure. Long exposures are great for things like waterfalls, and with astrophotography, we use long exposures because stars are so dim from Earth usually that we need a really long exposure to get a clean image with low ISO, which we'll talk about later, and a fast aperture, because stars are just so dim compared to most things we photograph. I mentioned camera shake because if you're hand holding a camera, there's vibrations from your body that get transferred to the camera, especially if you're cold and shivering or something like that. You want a high shutter speed so that the camera movement doesn't blur the image. So keeping shutter speeds fast is one of the main reasons that we need fast glass, fast lenses like f2.8 and f1.8 lenses. Those are very popular for sports and action because you need to have a high shutter speed so you can really benefit from that low ISO to freeze motion. So on to ISO next.